You're listening to One Free Family, a new take on peaceful parenting, where you can hear ideas for helping to raise free, independent, and peaceful children. Visit onefreefamily.com to connect and listen. Here are your hosts, James and Taylor Davis.
And we're back with another episode of One Free Family. This is James.
And Taylor.
And we are excited to bring you, I think, a pretty interesting topic today. Keep looking out the window. That's my nature. And Taylor's telling me I need to look better at the mic so I can talk in a way that you can actually hear me.
Just don't want anybody to miss a single word.
Yeah, that's true.
What you have to say.
Yeah, when you're dropping knowledge and science, it's important that everyone gets to partake.
Yep.
So one quick housekeeping note. You might notice that during the winter, our podcasts have been coming out a little bit more intermittently. We're probably looking at an every other week schedule for the next month or so. And that's because we have a very tight window during the week that we can actually record. And we've been using that to go skiing with our family this winter. So there's one day a week that we have to kind of pick. And it's been so fun and rewarding for our family to all get out and go skiing. So we've pushed these episodes by and large to every other week.
Yes. And as a result, we're kind of always scrambling to find night times to record because we just can't record when it's just us and the kids because...
For obvious reasons. Even at nighttime, it's been hard. Like our last episode, if you noticed, our voices like changing volume a little bit. It's because we literally had to record it in 3 parts with some sleep troubles that are going on. So anyway, we appreciate your patience. We are not going anywhere. We're just rewiring our schedule. Although I will say we have a few exciting guests coming up in the next couple weeks that you can look forward to. I'm talking to Stomping Ground co-founder and friend of mine, Sylvia Van Meerten, about working with kids with autism and other neuroatypical situations. And you're talking with...
And I'm talking with my friend Kelly Halderson, who is an unschooling mom of grown children and just an all-around really incredible person. She does a lot of really great work in the mental health field, and I'm going to talk to her. We haven't exactly landed on a topic because there's so many amazing things that she could talk to me about, but I think we might talk about managing relationships with people in our lives who are more difficult and how that can affect our parenting and, just some ideas for that.
Yeah. So, and if you have any other guests that you think would be fun on the One Free Family podcast, please do let us know. The best way to do that is probably just to hop in our One Free Family Facebook group and start a conversation about that. We read all of those, and I love to get in conversations with our One Free Family family.
What? Look what you did.
I just made something new up.
That was great.
So what are we talking about today, you might be wondering, given that we're already 2 minutes into the podcast? Well, today we're talking about, I think, actually a really important concept when it comes to the parenting mindset. And maybe it's a life hack in general to use it.
Yeah, I think you could use it in other parts of life too.
To hack other parts of your life,
hack
you could say. And this is something I've observed countless times, especially as I have gotten involved in, what's a good way to put it? Like groups that have some like label or something, or like groups that are not mainstream, I guess is a better way to put it.
Yeah.
So, when I first started dabbling in non-partisan politics, for instance, stepping past like the Democrat-Republican sort of thing, what you notice after that is that there's all these different little subgroups that have these really harshly defined labels. And it's all about, are you with us or are you against us?
Right. So it becomes pretty dogmatic.
Yeah. And there's almost like these like no true Scotsman level tests where it's like you tell someone you're a libertarian, for instance, and some percentage of those people will try to like test you to see if you're like libertarian as they are or something.
If you get to play.
Yeah, exactly. Or if you have the cred or whatever. And I don't know if it's a Western thing, but in America, where I live, there's just no shortage of ways that people are seeking to define themselves, right? So when you're a kid, it's like, what grade are you in? And that's a really fixed little basket. How old are you? Whatever. And then
what friend group are you in? Like as you get older, I think that can happen sometimes.
What sports teams do you root for? I know, like, are you a Yankees fan or a Mets fan? It was like a huge deal when I was growing up in New Jersey. There's of course the political parties that you can identify with, and that's never been more polarizing, probably at least in my lifetime, than it is today. And then when we get into the position where we become parents, well, there's all these gurus putting forth these different approaches to parenting, right?
Yeah.
There are the tiger moms and the peaceful parents and the attachment parents and
the natural parents,
the unschoolers and whatever. And oftentimes these approaches are just something one person or some small group of people made up as a parenting approach that has worked for them, or let's be honest, in some cases, it's just a parenting approach that they've idealized in their own mind, and they might not even totally fulfill all of the purest vision of. Unschooling is another term that's been used in this way. And I don't think this is really in the service of the consumer, the people that are looking for good parenting ideas, right?
I think a lot of us are more comfortable existing in this model that upholds binary, that like binary thinking, right? We like to be able to identify with something because I think it feels comfortable. And I'm kind of speaking for myself here. Yeah. It feels comfortable, and it kind of like gives you the false hope of not having to make too many hard decisions or really dig into your own values and what makes you tick and what works for you and your family. If you can just associate with one model of parenting, and then you can look to that to guide all of your decisions.
Right. I've seen people use religion this way too, actually. Like when we used to run a summer camp, one of the groups that would come was, you could call them a fringe religious group. They would use the facility for just their own purposes. And it was like so fascinating to me because so many people in that group were basically doing what you said. They were trying to take this one religious belief as a way to not have to do the hard work for themselves anymore. Right. They could turn to that religious belief to give them the answers, right? Rather than having to try to ask themselves the questions.
And I just wanted to dig into our motivations when it comes to why we kind of seek that binary, because I want to, for me, it helps demystify it a little bit. And also, I don't think anybody needs to have shame attached to the urge to do that. I think it's a really normal and natural thing. We want to find the places where we fit, the groups that we fit into. And then when it comes to parenting, it's like this unexplored frontier when you first become a parent, right? And it is so high stakes that we want answers and we want to feel confident that we're making the right decisions. And so I just really understand why we have that urge. But I think today we really just want to talk about why we have been working and why we have been working in our lives to kind of eschew those labels and more really tune into what just works for us and not feel tied to doing it the exact way that some particular expert or school of thought would say that you should.
Yeah, well, I think that's a good point, because I think exploring where that instinct comes from can help us to use it to our advantage, right? I think, seeking a tribe or seeking a community is a very human instinct, and finding people that you can discuss ideas with that can help you when you are struggling, I think that's where a lot of that comes from. And sometimes certain areas in life actually really do lend themselves to strict adherence to a certain idea, right? Like I think people that are on, say, people that are vegans, right, probably just want to really talk about veganism, which has like a really strict principle about what foods you can or cannot consume.
Like you're just not a vegan if you eat no animal products but eggs, right? Like there's just kind of is a binary there.
And if you're a vegan for the principled reasons of not wanting to consume animal products, then you're just going to want to be a total vegan, probably, right? Versus other areas in your life where, strict adherence to some framework maybe isn't as valuable. And at least for me in my journey so far being a parent, I haven't found, in spite of exhaustive research, any one particular group that would perfectly describe how I'm choosing to parent my kids right now. And I think it's just that parenting really doesn't lend itself to very many, perfect or true principles. Like there are some governing ideas I think you can get in your life that probably strict adherence to them makes sense, right? Like, thou shalt not kill, I think is a pretty good one, right? Like, don't go around killing people. Even like the golden rule, treating people with general kindness and consideration. I think you can look through the lens of those principles and do pretty well for yourself. One that I hold pretty closely is this idea of the non-aggression principle, which basically means that I don't think people should take other things from people without their consent or initiate force against other people to try to take things from them. I think in those areas in my life, I'm actually trying to move closer towards a stricter adherence to those ideas. But when it comes to parenting is this ever-changing journey where you're dealing with, let's face it, even if you only have one kid, that person is going to be 20 plus distinct people over the course of your time where you're in charge of keeping them safe and helping them grow and mature, right? They're going to have different goals, different things they struggle with, different needs. They're going to need you to be authoritative in some circumstances. They're going to need you to be loving and understanding in others. And no one has ever parented your kid before. So they're just not going to have perfect answers for exactly what you should say and exactly what you should do in all parenting circumstances.
And this actually made me think back to when I was a newer parent, when I don't even remember if our second had been born yet, but it was the first couple years of parenting. And it was when we had kind of stumbled upon ideas of unschooling. And so I started finding places on the internet where people were writing and talking about unschooling. And I, at first, really latched onto this idea of kids being the decision makers in their lives and full on freedom for kids about every single thing that happens in their day and in their lives. And I was invigorated by it, rightly so, because today I still hold on to a lot of that. But I also found myself feeling like if I liked this idea and I wanted to adopt it for my family, I had to do it the way that these people on the internet were saying that it needed to be done. And I remember I just remember really struggling with that and feeling like I had this idealized version in my head of the perfect parent, the perfect radical unschooling parent. But when I thought about making that a reality for our family, I could see where it was going to go. And it was going to go to a place of me getting pretty resentful and feeling like it wasn't okay to meet my own needs, because if they were ever in conflict with my kids, then I wasn't giving my kid the freedom that the radical unschooling philosophy said that I should. And so,
yeah, whatever the philosophy is saying, there are definitely people in every parenting group that are trying to figure out, are you in or are you out? Are you one of us? Because if you're not one of us, then you're somehow less than,
right. So what I'm saying is that I got so caught up in trying to figure out if I was one of them, right? And it kind of just got in the way of me actually figuring out who I wanted to be as a parent, because it felt right to me and because it was serving my child and serving my family, and that all of our needs and preferences were being considered as much as possible. And I still really do believe in a lot of the principles that you might find in some of the more dogmatic radical unschooling pages and blogs and groups. I also found that when I stopped worrying about whether or not I could call myself that or label myself that, and started tuning more into our family and what our individual needs were, which are ever changing, it flowed so much more easily and it felt so much more aligned.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think if you find yourself asking because I see this all the time in unschooling related groups, which incidentally, I wind up having a difficult time participating in a lot of times, because I feel this vicarious sense of pain for somebody when they're asking these questions hey guys, do I still get to be a radical unschooler if I force my kid to brush their teeth or something like that? And there's some subset of people that will say, no, you don't. You're not actually one of us anymore if you do that. And it's I guess if when I find myself asking the question, do I get to be a part of this group anymore if I make this decision that feels right for me and my family? I feel like I'm asking myself the wrong question.
It's almost a sign that you need to step back and reevaluate what you're even trying to do.
Right, because the point of finding answers in parenting is not to figure out what basket you fit in so that you can go return there for all the perfect answers in the future. And by the way, if it did work that way, you would already know it, right? You wouldn't have to ask yourself, does this fit perfectly into this philosophy of parenting? Because you would just find, I happen to do everything that fits into this parenting philosophy. So next time I come in with a tricky situation, I can just return here and get the perfect answer. But hey, the reality is there's no parenting philosophy out there. No individual guru anywhere has come up with the perfect silver bullet for every single kid in every single culture in every situation with all those different needs. And so I don't know, for me, and by the way, it's the same thing with listening to this podcast, right? If you're listening to this podcast and you want to join the One Free Family Facebook group and talk about parenting and try to figure out what's best for you and your family, it's not about hearing what we say. and doing what we do.
Yeah.
It's about, what was the quote that you said earlier from La Leche League?
Yeah. So a quote that La Leche League, which is like a breastfeeding support group all over the country, maybe the world, but they have a phrase that they say a lot, which is take what works for you and leave the rest. So it's like, it's that permission to, you know, reap the benefits of people who are, you know, sharing their ideas and doing a lot of work around parenting, but in a way that feels right for you. So it's, you know, really just paying attention to the different ideas you're reading out there, taking and trying out and using, and then keeping the things that work and leaving behind the ones that don't work for you. It doesn't mean they're bad. It doesn't mean they might not work really well for another family, but it's permission to customize and personalize your approach so that it actually serves your family. And your family includes you as a parent too, right? So I think as parents, we often think of the needs and preferences of our children first, which is okay and good, especially as parents who are trying to kind of respect our kids' autonomy as much as possible and be peaceful and gentle. And it doesn't mean that we need to, and I know we've said this before, but it doesn't mean that we need to completely ignore our own needs and preferences to the point where we are just basically being martyrs for the sake of our children, because that I think just breeds resentment and burnout, and it's not sustainable.
Well, right. And I think, again, as you're kind of picking through all of these different ideas and considerations on parenting better, I find a much more precise approach, at least for me, is to try to think of things on an issue specific basis. So I think there are actually principles that you can distill down to try to figure out, like a lot of it is trying to make a plan for what I'm going to do next time. And I think that actually is a pretty useful approach to thinking about my parenting, right? So in a case like this, I might think something like, okay, talk about spanking. I think spanking is one that we're pretty resolved on. Whatever different parenting approaches there are, I know that on this one issue of will I use force to punish my kids to make them regret something they did or to scare them away from doing it in the future, I know that I will not do that.
Right.
Now, I don't know if there's a we don't spank Facebook group out there. Maybe there is, maybe there isn't. But that's a principle I can pin down. And if I were struggling with, you know, the instinct to spank or something like that, I could go to Facebook groups and say, hey, I just keep getting the urge to spank my kids when they do whatever. What are some strategies other people have used that have been in a similar situation? I think that's a really useful way to look at a specific parenting issue. I think on the flip side, if I started with, well, I know I don't want to spank my kids, and then I just tried to find a parenting label that, like say peaceful parenting, that didn't involve spanking, I might just be signing up for a whole basket of things that I don't necessarily agree with, right? And again, you don't need to, it's not like you're electing a president of your family and you must pick the parenting party that best aligns with your principles. Like thinking of parenting things on a single issue basis with your partner if you're raising a child with someone else, or just with yourself or your local support group. I don't know. I just find that it bears so much more fruit.
I think you also, though, if you're taking it issue by issue, I feel like for us, we still do that within the framework of the priorities that we hold most dear to our family, right? Mm-hmm. Like we maybe do look at the issues and we choose X when it comes to this issue and Y when it comes to this issue. But I think what actually helps me is when I'm having trouble deciding what to try, I do try to go back to like, what are our core principles and values? And does making this next decision in this way feel like it's going to support those core values? Or if I've made the decision, then I reflect, right? If I wasn't sure and I made a decision and I did something some way, looking back and saying, did the outcome kind of support our core values? Because that can help guide me as well. So I think I do like the idea of taking it issue by issue. But when that still feels like hard or confusing, I will come back to kind of like those core principles.
No, you're right. Well, I think that's the process of examining any given issue, right? So I think as you peel back the layers and you get down further and further to where your core values lie, I think those will kind of inform a lot of these single issues and make them a little bit easier, right? So in our family, that might look like, like I'd say one of the general principles that we try to adhere to is to not force our kids to do something that they really don't want to do unless we can be super, super confident that in the future they will be not very resentful of it. So an example might be on the extreme end, it would be like, I really don't want to take this yucky medicine. Well, it's like, this medicine is to cure this bacterial infection. And if we don't take it, then you could maybe like die from this ear infection or whatever it is, right? I think in that kind of situation, we can, again, confidently look to the future and say, yeah, when this person's 25, they're extremely unlikely to resent this decision being made for them, even though we weren't totally taking their consent into consideration or whatever. And that principle alone has informed a ton of different things, right? Like, you know, our decisions to not send our kids to school unless they want to go, or our general goals in life to structure our house in such a way that they can mostly do the things they want, right? And, you know, it would obviously align with the decision to not spank them too. That probably goes back to that same philosophy where it's like, yeah, we really don't want them to do something, but one strategy we won't use is to physically harm them in order to persuade them as such, right?
But I think I'm actually glad you brought up that example, because it's a good one to use to explain where we sometimes might make a decision that might not seem like it perfectly aligns with that value or like fits into a basket. So if you say, you know, one of our values is to kind of like not force our kids to do things they don't want to do, there are some situations in which we will kind of, and in the past we have kind of exercised like being the parent and the privilege that comes with that, when it comes down to, for example, maybe going somewhere that everyone in the family wants to go except for one person, right?
Sure.
And so we kind of look at that situation, like you said, almost like an issues-based, way of looking at things. And we say, okay, we look at all the variables surrounding it. We've had a couple days at home. Mom and dad and child 1 and child 2 really want to go do this thing. And so, and you're not old enough to stay home by yourself. None of us feel safe with that yet. There's nobody who can watch you. So we're just going to go do this thing today. And it's not a situation, we're not putting them in a situation where like they're feeling nervous or unsafe, because we're not like bringing them somewhere and leaving them there that they don't want to be, right? We're usually typically going somewhere together, and then we brainstorm around what might you want to bring with you to do if you're not super interested in the thing that we're going to do. What ways can we think about to make it seem like it's, or to make it like it's going to be more fun for you? Let's talk now about how long we plan to stay, right? So it's like that thinking outside the box, and that being okay with occasionally we're going to have to be flexible in our approach, instead of saying like, well, we never make our kids do anything that they don't want to do, because in that situation, it's like the kid who wants to stay home more almost then just gets to decide the daily fate of the whole family every day, all day, every day, which is not going to feel good to the family as a whole.
Well, again, I picture having that discussion with that child when he's 25 and saying, say he was like, I always hated when you would drag me out to whatever, the playground with all those kids, and I didn't want to go. And I feel like with the 25-year-old, I could say, I totally hear you. And the reality was, though, there were 5 of us in the family,
right? And
like we all felt similarly about being at home all the time. And so
we needed to find a balance.
And I think you can do this in a loving way, right? Like you can say like, we are going to go out, and I understand why that's frustrating.
You can validate those feelings.
I don't have to get like really frustrated or angry with that kid for not understanding the decision. But right, I think. And
you also can, in those situations, continue to like exercise that creative thinking around, is there any way, before you make that decision fully, is there any way to support this kid better, right? Like, is there somebody who'd be willing to watch him that he's comfortable with? Or yeah, just instead of just like the hard and fast, we're going and you're coming, right? You're still working with the kid on if there are other options, and if there aren't, how to make it more palatable and things like that. And like you said, you're validating their feelings about it.
Right. And I think it's okay, though, to have the reality in your family of when push comes to shove, ultimately a parent will probably have the final say in the hardest areas in life, right? And I think that's like, you can disagree, but my opinion is that, and you don't want to use that power in a wanton fashion. You want to be able to really leave that aside for only the extreme circumstances, hopefully, and only the ones where it's really, really necessary. But I guess it's like, generally speaking, when it comes to parenting, I've found that I want to get rid of all the nevers and all the absolutes, we would never do this. We really save those for the times where it's actually going to be accurate. Like for me, like I said, spanking, I think can fall in that category. But it's just a very nuanced thing. And you don't want to be lazy about it. Like you don't want to say, oh, well, I'm a parent. Sometimes I just get to be the final decision maker without exploring other options. But it's okay to acknowledge the reality of the situation, you know?
It is. And I think you have to be careful with that, because I think if you have that mindset, you could fall into the trap of like making it appear to your kids like they have a say in a bunch of things, but basically always deciding anyway. So like,
but that's the opposite.
You have this whole conversation about what everybody wants to do, but then ultimately you just make the decision you were going to make anyway. So now you've wasted everybody's time. And also your kids just don't know if they can trust that their voice is really mattering. I'm saying exactly what you are, I think, in a different way, which is, I think you start with the acknowledgement, like the joint understanding of the reality of our life, which is that in the most extreme circumstances, the parents will have the final say. And then where you can find room for consensus-based decision-making and all these other wonderful things that you and I think, incorporate into our life more than a lot of people would. But have those be real and authentic. Like we've done our Monday fun days in the past, where we take turns as family members deciding what we're going to go do on Mondays. We have just given the kids the reins and said, you pick. It's your Monday. You pick. We'll all go do what it is, as long as it doesn't cost $1 million or something like that. Mm-hmm. And I think they also understand. They understand when we're going to be the final decision makers, and they understand. Well, that's really important.
When it's authentically a group
It's really
decision.
important. Like that's something that I continue to have to relearn is, if something ultimately, for whatever reason, if I feel good about the reason and I've examined it, if something is not really up for conversation or not a question, I want to try to really be careful from the outset to not frame it as one, because I don't want to give my kids the impression that I'm kind of like taking their opinion into consideration if I'm ultimately not planning on doing that, whether it's just because like child X has made this commitment to take this class and there's nobody else to watch the other kids. So like, we just all have to go. I don't want to make it seem like that's up for debate if it just can't be. So yeah, Absolutely. It's like establishing those expectations at the beginning, where on the other hand, if it really is up for debate, like, oh, this kid needs to go to this class, but grandma said she'd be willing to watch people who didn't want to go. If I'm really willing to just let them decide, then I can just say that at the beginning and then let them decide without any sort of like manipulation or trying to convince them to make one choice or the other.
Sure. And I think this has been sort of like an interesting rabbit hole or case study on how we would go about making one particular decision.
That was a rabbit hole.
It was a little bit of a rabbit hole.
We went down
So I know. That's why I'm trying to get us back up.
Yeah, let's climb out.
To the outside of the
Whatever.
rabbit hole.
I think real life situations can be helpful.
Yeah, it's illuminating. But I think, it's again, back to helping people and helping ourselves develop a framework for how do we approach these given situations? Because if we're saying that it's probably not useful to pick your guru or your approach and go back and say, well, what would if I want to be a radical unschooler, how should I handle this situation? And instead go through all the different parenting ideas and schools of thought out there and view them as a menu when you're going out for a nice dinner, and you look and say, some people like foie gras, not me. I'm not going to get that, know? And I think if step one is sitting with the other decision maker in your home or just with yourself, if you're a single parent, and really thinking, okay, what are the things in my mind that I'm not going to negotiate on? I'm going to do my best to not yell at my kids, or I'm going to do my best to not use shame to try to manipulate my kids' decisions. Or like you go through, and maybe even making a physical list could be useful for the list people out there. I happen to be a list person. And you make that list and you say like, okay, here are the things that I feel as though I must hold to. Now, I don't think you want to chisel these into a big stone or anything, because you might find that situations present themselves that cause you to want to revise a little bit. But you start with those as your pretty firm basis. And then from there, then you can go through, and you don't have to be, because I think the other thing I've observed is that sometimes people are almost scared to, say, watch a news source from Like if you're a liberal, you might even be scared to watch Fox News, or if you're a conservative, you might be scared to watch MSNBC, because doing so almost feels like you're like cheating on your true roots. It's like you don't want to go there and wonder if there's any good ideas there, because that's somehow counter to who you are and to what you believe. But if you start with the approach of, well, here's who I am, here are my beliefs and my principles, and now I can go, and in the case of parenting, I can go read a book about radical unschooling. And if I find 3 things in this book that might be helpful for me in my life, or those wind up being like perfect little pieces to answering the little issues that come up for me and my family, great. And if I want to force my kids to brush their teeth, even when they don't want to, that's still okay, because that adheres to the principle I have of my chief goal being to keep their body physically safe and ready for adulthood someday. But then this other principle of helping my kids, not passing judgment on the different types of interests they pursue, that also aligns with my belief system, right? And you don't have to be intimidated to dive into all different schools of thoughts. It can be exciting, in fact. Instead of the overwhelming feeling of picking who you are, it can be exciting. Like, ooh, I wonder if there's any good ideas in this attachment parenting thing that I can pull into my life.
Yeah, and I think the most powerful thing about that, about kind of creating your own list and then using that as your reference point when you go and get outside ideas, is that you are starting with yourself and you're looking within yourself and within your family to decide on your family culture. And that's really powerful, because when you look within, instead of looking for answers from outside of you and your family system, then the decisions you make are going to feel so much more aligned with what matters to you and your family. And they're going to be easier to put into action, because they're going to feel real and authentic. Like, I think one thing that I see a lot with people, especially who are trying to be gentle parents, and maybe especially with that radical unschooling label, is people are trying to implement these approaches with their kids that actually don't feel authentically aligned with who they want to be as parents, or with, and maybe even on the other end too. I think a lot of people maybe also try to implement really authoritative approaches with their kids that their gut instinct is telling them don't align with how they want to be in relationship with their children. So I think it's like almost on both ends of the spectrum. Right. When we're looking outside of what feels right for us and our family, it's so much harder to authentically make those choices and be that way with our kids, because that inner voice keeps telling us like, no, this doesn't feel right. And that inner voice notices like, this isn't working for my kid, but they say I should keep doing it. And I identify with this label. So it's so, I mean, and I talk about this in, I think you said this at the beginning when we started talking today. It's so applicable to so many parts of life. I talk about this with people when they're kind of making decisions about the environments in which they want to give birth and the people who they want to bring in to support them at their births. When I work with people as a doula, like, you're going to know when you're making a choice because somebody else, or you even perceive that somebody else or some other philosophy thinks you should be, you're going to feel that feeling, and it's never going to feel authentic. So I think having, like you said, kind of creating your own list and using that as your touch point when you go and try to get ideas from other places is just so incredibly powerful.
Yeah, well said. I think that point about your new ideas or your new habits that you're trying to build being more likely to stick when they're ones that you've chosen for yourself rather than ones that you feel are almost like being imposed upon you by,
or like you're obligated to use.
Yeah, what school of thought. It's so much more likely to make that meaningful change that you're trying to make in your family. Like, because obviously if you're out there seeking parenting ideas, it's because you are hoping for better outcomes for you and your family, or whether it's some future thing that you're haven't approached yet. Like maybe you have young kids and you're nervous about how you're going to handle discussions around, sex or drugs and alcohol or something like that. Or it's just something you're dealing with right now. My baby won't sleep through the night. How do I, either change my mindset or change the outcomes of what's happening here? As soon as you, again, start with the things, because like, for instance, this would have been helpful for us early on. If we had more closely aligned ourselves with what our parenting principles were going to be before we started dealing with the baby's sleep troubles, then we could have much more easily, I think, dealt with some of the big difficulties around sleep, because certain options that we wound up exploring would have been, we would have realized that they should be off the table, right? Because they didn't necessarily align with who we wanted to be as parents. But in that case, we were basically just trying to get this holy grail of the baby who sleeps through the night. And that to us, we put the trees before the forest. And instead of looking at the big picture and figuring out who we wanted to be as parents, we just tried to accomplish that one specific goal because for whatever reason, whether it was society or our own internal voices, that just felt like the most important thing at the time. And I've seen this in my camping work as well, too, where a parent has one specific goal, like this kid must get into the best possible college, right? So now everything the parent does is geared towards that. It's like paying them to get straight A's or forcing them to do charity work or forcing them to play an instrument, even though they don't really want to. And then when it's all said and done, they've really strained their relationship with their kid. And then maybe they got this great college thing. Maybe they didn't, but they're not really always happy with the result, right? Because even though they got this one specific thing, it was at the cost of something that they valued even more, which was the relationship to their child. So yeah, so I think as a framework, doing that work on yourself, figuring out what your actual parenting priorities are, and then almost equipping yourself with that, arming yourself with that knowledge, and really like strengthening yourself and your own resolve before you head out into the parenting world. Because I think the risk otherwise is, and I've seen this too, like there are people in these like unschooling groups that very obviously don't agree with many of even the basic tenets of unschooling. And then they join these groups and then they feel almost like ashamed when they don't agree with it, even though they don't have to. Like they don't, you're not actually better if you're a strict adherent to any philosophy or another.
And I think also I would say to kind of balance this out is if you are trying out some things from like a new philosophy that don't instantly feel right to you, but that you actually can see that there could be a lot of value in them. I think it's important to listen to that too, because a lot of principles around self-directed learning and giving our kids more autonomy are going to feel really weird at first because it's just so different than the paradigm many of us grew up with. And so I don't want to kind of give the impression that I think that every time you come up against discomfort, that means that your gut is telling you it's wrong. Right. And hopefully now I don't sound like I'm contradicting myself.
No, you're not.
But I do think it's important to understand that like discomfort can also be a sign that we just want to keep learning more and keep exploring. And so again, it's just about tuning back into yourself and figuring out where on the scale that's falling for you, and knowing that in some situations that discomfort actually is asking you to dig further in and to do some deschooling, which we've talked about on past episodes.
Well, you're actually just crushing it with that point. I don't know if you were aware of it.
Crushed it.
But no, I think that's a perfect point. And it actually brings me back to one of my pet interests right now, which is this internal family systems therapy approach, where I would, or IFS probably would say that the part of you that is feeling scared and challenged in those moments actually is almost like a distinct part of your psyche than the decision-making part of you. And IFS would call, like when you're sitting and like listening to parenting podcasts or having thoughtful discussions with your partner about what approach you're going to take in what situation, that's like yourself, right? Like that's like the calm, the rational part of you that is looking at all the information and trying to make the best decision with what information it has available. And then when you're in the stressful situation, that would be called like a trailhead, an IFS, or like the stressful stimulus approaches, there's a part of you that wants to protect you from that really difficult situation by doubting, by telling you that it's not right, so that it basically wants to protect you from having to keep doing this really challenging or difficult thing. But I think I would listen more carefully to that thoughtful part of yourself, the part that sits there and really tries to chew on what feels like the best approach, rather than, because I think sometimes we can mistake our quote unquote gut for a part of us that just gets scared easily about new ideas.
Sure.
You know? So I think that was a super powerful
point. So
point.
I think it's about kind of, again, just like you said, tuning into that thoughtful and logical and balanced part of ourselves to really dig in and decide what feels like it's worth trying. And then it's about like trying things that you feel like are really going to be good things to try, and reflecting and talking to your family, your kids and your partner about how it's feeling for everybody, and being willing to like give things enough time to know if you really gave it a good go to see if it's working for everybody, being willing to abandon things that everybody is sending clear signals that aren't working, and then just being flexible, right? And being willing to try new things, embrace new truths as they come to be known, and kind of just keep moving forward in a way that feels authentic for you and your family, and in a way that's serving you where it's going to be sustainable.
Well, that was well said, my dear. And the two factors of the guy starting up the snowblower outside and probably joining us on this episode, and you putting such a good pin in it, leads me to believe that maybe it's time to wrap it up.
It's a wrap. Thank you for joining us on this journey, and remember that each moment is a new opportunity to be the parent that you hope to be.
And I want to say that I love you guys, and we will see you next time.
Thank you for listening to One Free Family. If you enjoy the podcast, please show your support by becoming a patron at onefreefamily.com/support. Your support will help make this show better. Plus, you can get access to rewards and additional episodes by joining. Again, that's onefreefamily.com/support. This has been a Pax Libertas Productions podcast.